Thank you so much, Daniel, for the partial introduction, and thanks everyone for being here today. So my name is Kasra Motlaghzadeh. I'm a PhD candidate at the System Design Engineering at the University of Waterloo. And without, how should I go to next?
Oh, sorry.
This green button?
Yeah, the big green one.
Big one. Okay, yeah. Before diving into the details, I would like to acknowledge my collaborators from University of Waterloo and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. And today I'll highlight the key findings from two studies that we conducted over the past 3 years. The recent one was basically understanding the role of CDR in Canada's climate plan and incorporating the equity principles. And the second one, which was published 2 years ago, it was more about the uncertainties that are understandable from the global projections of director capture. So, just getting a little sense of the science beyond CDR, I'm sure that we have already seen this slide on the first day at Sean's presentation, but it's very important to understand the context at which CDR plays a role. So there is a near linear relationship between the cumulative CO2 emissions since 1850 and the global warming level, again related to the pre-industrial levels, and you can see that at the figure at the right. So that basically means that in the y-axis you have the temperature increase, and in the x-axis you have the cumulative CO2 emissions. And that means that for any specific temperature target, you have a corresponding global carbon budget for that one. And basically, when you draw a line on the y-axis, for example, for 1.5 degree, then move to the right on the curve, and then down to the x-axis, you get a sense how much of that budget is. But the thing is that we have already emitted like 2,500 gigatons of CO2 since 1850, and what really matters is like how much of that budget is remaining. And you can see those numbers at the left on the table for different temperature targets and different levels of certainty. And if you look at 1.5 degree, it's like with a probability of 83, like staying below 1.5, you have at most like 100 gigatons of CO2 left. And assuming the 40 gigatons of CO2 emissions globally, that would be exhausted by sometime in 2026. Or even if you go with like lower certainty, that might be extended a little, like to 2029. And that means basically that we are going to overshoot those budgets for 1.5. Even some people already think that it has already occurred. Some people think that it might happen in a few years. And how this relates to CDR. Basically, first, you have a limited remaining carbon budget. So basically, the net zero is necessary. So because you have to reach a net zero to stop the global warming. And that is basically why many countries have pledged their net zero targets. So there is a role for CDR, the first role that we heard more about in this, like the talks during these 2 days. That is basically compensating for residual emissions. Those sectors that are not alternative, or the alternatives are very expensive. So there's a role for CDR for compensating for those residual emissions and reaching net zero. But the other role is about the overshoot budget. We are going to overshoot, even if all countries reach their net zero targets by the time that they have pledged, there would be around 450 to 815 of more CO2 emissions, depending on the path that they select or they go to the net zero point. And like adding that to the budgets that we had on the previous slide, that would lead to around like 250 to 750 of carbon overshoot. And CDR might help to reverse that overshoot and makes it like temporary. Although overshoot is not like desirable, there are some climate impacts that you cannot reverse them. But the thing is that unfortunately we are on this track. So CDR might like help us to reduce the concentration of CO2 and get back to 1.5 or a safer level of climate change later in the century. And that was also evident in the IPC scenarios that you can see at the right. Scenarios first start like with decarbonizing. At some time they reach net zero between 2050 and 2070, and then they enter like a period that your total emissions are negative. That basically means your carbon sinks are larger than carbon sources. And I should mention that these scenarios are from IPCC AR6. So I think most of the studies that was reviewed by IPCC at that time were based on like before 2019, 2018, that was the end of the cycle. So then they were assuming that the mitigation starts right after those years. So, but we know that this didn't happen. And for in the next round, you would see probably, you would not see scenarios with no or low overshoot temperature. And you would see probably like more CDR deployment for the end of the century. And this about the second role of the CDR that was about like reducing the concentration of CO2, it's important to understand like who should bear that responsibility. So, and that brings us to the concept of equity. So in the Paris Agreement, we have some statements about equity. We just read from that from Article 2.2. This agreement will be implemented to reflect equity and the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. So this like broad concept has been translated to a few burden sharing principles that touch on different dimensions of equity. Here in the table you can see them. Some of them are more equitable compared to other, so there are like lots of criticism going to for some of them. I start just reviewing some of them. Sovereignty is based on the historical emissions and established usage rights, and this has been highly criticized because that basically means that those countries that currently have high emissions should be allowed to have more emissions during the rest of the century. We have the equality, that means that all individuals have the equal access, equal rights to the atmospheric space. And we have capability, that basically means countries with greater economic resources should carry more of the burden of the climate mitigation. And we have responsibility, that basically tracks the emissions from the time that we understood there is a climate change to now, and basically those countries with higher historical responsibility for the climate change that we are seeing today would bear more of the burden. And in our paper, we had a few research questions. We reviewed the Canadian modeling studies, and we understood that most of them would stop at net zero, and there was, to our knowledge, there was no study that considered what happens after net zero. But what we see from the carbon budgets, we know like some countries should have CDR deployed at a larger scale post net zero if they want to achieve the global 1.5 degree and if they want to contribute in an equitable way. And we also explored how the technological uncertainties and social uncertainties for individual CDR methods would change the portfolio of the CDR that you might have. And the last thing that we also explored in that paper, but I'm not going to present, but feel free to go there, is about like the growth rates that our model is projecting, whether they were like unprecedented or not. So we also compared the growth rates of the technologies in our model's projections with the historical adoption of technologies in Canada. And we used basically two burden sharing principles, equal per capita and per capita convergence. But we got them like from a study by Villegas and colleagues in 2022, where they modified those principles and responded to some of the criticism that those two methods were facing. And we got those like remaining carbon budgets for Canada. We estimated how much the emissions till the net zero point would be for Canada. And then we found the carbon debt post net zero, which we fed into the integrated assessment model, GCAM, to understand what could be the role of different CDR methods. So I will start with the emissions and removals by sector. On the left, you are seeing the no policy scenario. That basically means that there is no climate policy. Even the existing climate policies are lifted. So what you're seeing is a slight increase in the emissions by different sectors. And the purpose of that scenario is just for the comparison. And at the right, we are seeing the net zero 2050. It's not the equity-based scenario, it's just the net zero 2050, and then it stays there for the rest of the century. At the time of net zero, we have still some residual emissions, around 150 megatons of CO2, and they are mostly being compensated by bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and for producing hydrogen and electricity. There is a small role for enhanced rock weathering, and also very, very small role for direct air capture. But by the time that direct air capture becomes more mature or the cost drop, we'll see like a slight increase in the residual emission and more DAC deployment by the end of century. But overall, the total emissions is basically net zero. And now we are transitioning to the equity-based scenario. At the left, you are seeing that net zero scenario I showed you, and at the right, you are seeing a moderate equity-based scenario. That is basically a scenario that after achieving net zero, Canada should also pay back a carbon debt around like 6.7 gigatons of CO2. And how it does that is basically through like additional CDR deployment and reaching total negative emissions. And in this scenario, as we can expect, we are seeing a much more larger role for CDR methods such as direct air capture, especially by 2100, DAC is going to be deployed around 200 megatons in CO2, enhanced rock weathering around 100 megatons, and etc. So, but there is also the equal per capita scenario that is very like the most ambitious equity-based scenario that basically all the people who have been living from 1990 to 2100 have the equal right to emit. And in that scenario, again, like the role of CDR would be much more larger. DAC might be deployed around 300 megatons by the end of the century, enhanced weathering around like 150. But the thing is that like transitioning from that PCC scenario to this scenario, we are not seeing so much increase in the BECS deployment, and that is basically because BECS the threshold has already reached in the PCC scenario. And so we mostly explored like how the uncertainties about the total CDR demand were in the previous slide. That is basically a function of like the international burden sharing principle or how much residual emissions you might have. But also there is another thing, what would be the role of individual technologies in meeting those CDR demands? And that basically like how each technology is like doing compared to other ones. So we explored a bunch of sensitivity analysis, like what would happen if the cost of DAC drops, or what would happen if you don't see like a cost economic of scale happening for DAC, what happens if you have like a limited biomass availability. And by default, we didn't include land use emissions in our model. Like we didn't assume that land use is going to be a carbon sink because of the recent trends, but what happens if you have some kind of contribution from land use? So these are the things that you can go and explore from the paper. And conclusions. So there are two main roles for the CDR. One was for compensating the residual emissions. If you decarbonize less, if you have more residual emissions, both CO2 and non-CO2, you are going to have a higher CDR deployment for that purpose. And the other role that might be more significant is that the ones that comes from the overshoot phase. What would be Canada's role in reducing the global CO2 concentration and bringing down the temperature to 1.5? And we quantified them through different equity principles. And for countries such as Canada that has like higher historical per capita emissions compared to other countries, net zero is not an end. And those numbers post net zero might be also like useful today when you are thinking about those technologies, because some of those decisions should be taken now if you want to deploy like DAC at the largest scale that you saw in some of the scenarios. And this study was mostly about the global dimension of equity, how you are going to share this burden between different countries. And we all know that all of these technologies are novel almost. There's a huge uncertainty. So there's also a local dimension of equity that we don't want these technologies to make the local livelihoods of people, both like social, environmental impacts. So that was also like one of the things that in future we might explore. And with that, I would finish my presentation. Thank you.
So we'll do the same thing if there's a couple questions directly related to that presentation. And if there aren't any now, you can save them for the panel at the end. That's also fine. But there is one. Go ahead, Jordan.
Oh, no, I know I gotta get up. Don't worry. Although I heard everybody laugh, so I think I was loud enough. No, sorry. My question is about the scenario shifts when you started limiting some of the factors. Like the one that really stood out to me was the limited biomass scenario. When I looked at it, I expected biomass to be gone or, smaller, but there was almost no enhanced rock weathering, and DAC had almost quadrupled in size. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about some of the interactions there in the scenarios that you were looking at, and why if you're limiting biomass, DAC seems to grow so much to take away from others.
Yeah, I think in the scenarios that we have a limited biomass, there was an increase in the DAC deployment because the model is trying to reach that like negative emission with supply from other technologies, and it was mostly from DAC and enhanced rock weathering. And we should also think that whatever the results of this model is based on the CDR portfolio that are currently available in GCAM, for example. If you have like some additional CDR methods, like for example like marine CDR methods, you might see like a smaller change in the increase in the DACs or enhanced rock weathering deployment. Yeah, but overall it was like when you limit one technology, it would be compensated by another one.